In the kingdom of Odoro, where towering stone castles and lush green fields marked the landscapes, Prince Caden stood alone at the highest tower of his castle. The winds whispered through the ancient walls, and below, the kingdom spread out like a patchwork of memories, a place that once filled his heart with warmth, but now only served as a reminder of everything he had lost. Caden was the crown prince of Odoro, respected by all, admired for his strength and leadership. Yet, behind his regal facade, a deep sadness clung to him like a shadow. His life, once filled with promise, had been shattered by the woman he had loved most, Lady Annabelle. From a young age, Caden and Annabelle's bond had been unbreakable. Their parents had promised them to each other, forging an alliance that would strengthen both their families. They had grown up together, learning about their duties, their futures, and above all, their love for one another. It was supposed to be the perfect union, a love story destined to be written in the annals of history. But fate had other plans. The memory of the betrayal still burned in Caden's mind, as fresh as the day it happened. He had been eagerly anticipating his wedding to Annabelle, the woman he was about to call his wife. His heart had swelled with excitement, imagining the life they would share, the children they would raise, and the future they would build together. But on the eve of their wedding, everything changed. Caden had walked into the gardens of the castle that night, expecting to find peace in the quiet of the evening. Instead, what he saw shattered his world. There, beneath the moonlight, was Annabelle, his beloved fiancée, locked in an intimate embrace with Lord Adrian, his childhood friend and confidant. The sight of them together struck him like a blade to the chest. His best friend, the man he had trusted, had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and the woman he had once loved had chosen him. The shock of the moment left Caden frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. His world, once so secure, had crumbled in an instant. His anger surged, mingled with disbelief, and what hurt more than the betrayal itself was the realization that his love for Annabelle had been nothing more than a lie. That night, he learned a bitter truth. Love could be as fragile as glass, easily shattered by the hands of those you trusted most. As the years passed, the pain of that moment festered within him, and the love he once felt for Annabelle turned to ashes. It was no longer a simple heartbreak. No, it had become something darker, something vengeful. Caden couldn't move on, couldn't let go of the rage that burned deep within him. He would have his revenge. The idea came to him one evening as he sat alone in his study, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on him. He would marry her, Annabelle, the woman who had broken him, and he would do it not out of love, but out of a cold desire for revenge. He would take her in front of everyone, bind her to him with the chains of marriage, and then, once she had given everything, he would abandon her. The thought of humiliating her, making her feel the betrayal that he had felt, gave him a twisted sense of justice. She would suffer as he had suffered, and only then would he be free. Yet, even as he formed these plans, a part of him wrestled with the idea. There was still a piece of him, deep down, that wished things had gone differently. A small part of him still longed for the love they had once shared, but it was drowned out by the fire of vengeance. Every night, as he lay in his bed, Caden fought with himself, his heart pulling him one way, his anger dragging him another. But the decision had been made. He would marry Annabelle. He would make her his, and in doing so, he would take everything from her, just as she had taken everything from him. The wedding was already being planned, the arrangements already set in motion. He would show her just how powerful his revenge could be. And in doing so, perhaps he would finally be able to move on from the pain that had haunted him for so long. The proposal took Lady Annabelle completely off guard. The words that slipped from Prince Caden's lips felt like an impossibility to her, a cruel trick of fate. After all that had happened, after the betrayal that had torn their once promising relationship apart, She never imagined that Caden would come to her again. Yet, here he was, standing before her, his cold eyes locked onto hers as he extended the offer of marriage. "Annabelle, will you marry me?" Caden's voice was devoid of warmth, and the emptiness of the words hung heavily in the air. For a long moment, Annabelle could only stand there, stunned, her heart racing. Her mind spun, torn between the confusion of the moment and the guilt that gnawed at her from within. She knew she had wronged him, hurt him in ways she could never undo. The thought of facing him after everything seemed impossible. But what choice did she have? Her family, her very future, depended on this. The scandal she had caused with Lord Adrian's betrayal had not only ruined her relationship with Caden, but also tarnished the reputation of her family. Her father, her mother. They had made it clear, this marriage to Caden was the only way to repair their standing, to restore the dignity they had lost. There was no escape for Annabelle. As much as she wanted to run, to hide from the shame she felt, her family's expectations loomed over her. They didn't care about her heart. They cared about their name, their status, their power. And if marrying Caden was the price she had to pay to regain it, then she would have no choice but to comply. But in that moment, as she met his gaze, the weight of her betrayal hit her harder than ever before. Caden's face was an impassive mask, his eyes unreadable as he waited for her response. The prince knew the power he held in this moment. Annabelle was trapped, and he relished in her discomfort. She was now the one at his mercy. "I will marry you," Annabelle said finally, her voice shaky but firm. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but they were the only words that could secure her future. As soon as she said them, she knew that her life, her freedom, would no longer belong to her. She had sold it all in that single sentence. Caden simply nodded, his expression unchanged, his thoughts distant. He had already moved on, already calculating every move. This marriage would be his triumph, a triumph not of love, but of vengeance. He would have her at his side, a symbol of everything she had taken from him. She would be his prisoner, bound by the very vows that should have bound them in love. The engagement was announced shortly after, and the preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Caden's actions were methodical, deliberate. He had already made it clear that he would marry Annabelle, but there was no joy in it for him, only cold satisfaction. Every detail, every plan, was made with a single purpose in mind: to humiliate her. There would be no tenderness in their union, no warm glances, no soft words. He would carry out the marriage with indifference, treating her as nothing more than a tool to achieve his revenge. He ordered lavish decorations, extravagant feasts, all for the public eye, to create the illusion of a joyous occasion. But behind the facade, he was calculating, orchestrating each moment with precision. His every action was a reminder to Annabelle of what she had done, a constant demonstration of his control over her. She could feel the tension in the air, the oppressive weight of his coldness that hung between them, a stark contrast to the warmth they had once shared. Annabelle, for her part, struggled to navigate the new dynamics of their relationship. She had lost the man she loved, and in return, she was given a cold, distant stranger. She tried, oh how she tried, to win back the affection she had once enjoyed from Caden. She sent him gifts, wrote him letters, but every attempt was met with silence or indifference. Caden was not the boy she had once known. The man before her was a prince of ice, a ruler who had learned to bury his emotions beneath the weight of his anger. As the wedding day grew nearer, the power dynamics between them shifted. Annabelle had once held the reins of their relationship, but now she was at Caden's mercy. He was in control, and she could feel it with every passing day. Every glance, every word, every gesture was a reminder that she had no power in this marriage. She had only herself to blame. Her heart was heavy with guilt, with regret, and with the desperate desire to make things right. But deep down, she knew it was too late. She had betrayed the one person who had trusted her, and no amount of effort on her part could undo the damage. Caden would never forgive her, not completely, not truly. And in the end, he didn't want forgiveness. He wanted revenge. The day of the wedding dawned, with all the grandeur that could be expected from the union of two noble families. The kingdom was abuzz with excitement as the long-anticipated ceremony was about to take place. Guests from far and wide filled the grand halls of the palace, their eyes trained on the magnificent affair unfolding before them. It was a celebration of tradition, of power, and of reputation, with every detail meticulously planned to ensure a flawless event. But beneath the surface of opulence and ceremony, there was a simmering tension that could not be ignored. Lady Annabelle, dressed in an elaborate gown of ivory silk, felt every ounce of the weight of her actions pressing down on her as she stood at the top of the aisle. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as they gripped the delicate bouquet of roses she held. As she began her slow walk down the aisle, the eyes of the kingdom upon her, she couldn't help but notice the coldness in Caden's gaze. He stood at the altar, looking every bit the prince, regal and composed. But his eyes betrayed nothing of the affection she had once hoped for. They were empty, void of the love that once flourished between them. His expression was the perfect mask of politeness, but there was no warmth, no tenderness in his demeanor. Every step she took felt like a step toward her doom, each one echoing in her ears as she approached the man who had once been her everything. The weight of guilt crushed her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had wronged him, and now she was paying the price. This was not the wedding she had dreamed of, the one where she would walk down the aisle to the love of her life. This was a performance, a show for the public, for the nobility, for her family's reputation. She had no choice but to accept the reality of it all, no matter how much it hurt. Caden's indifference was palpable, and Annabelle felt it in every nerve of her body. He didn't reach for her hand as she arrived at the altar. He didn't speak a kind word. Instead, he stood like a statue, his face carved in stone, his eyes cold and calculating. She could feel the distance between them, the chasm that had opened up between them long ago, and now it was impossible to bridge. The man who had once been her confidant, her lover, was now nothing more than a stranger. As the ceremony unfolded, Caden's demeanor remained unchanged. He was polite, courteous, and every word he spoke was carefully measured, but there was no affection in his voice. He kept her at arm's length, both physically and emotionally, as if she were nothing more than a pawn in his game of revenge. He was going through the motions, but his thoughts were far from the vows they were exchanging. His heart, once full of love, was now filled with bitterness and resentment. The marriage that had once been a symbol of union and hope was now a symbol of betrayal and cold retribution. The vows were exchanged, and Annabelle could hear the finality in Caden's voice. There was no softness, no tenderness in the words he spoke. They were formal, detached, and it was clear that this union meant nothing to him but a chance to humiliate her, to make her feel the pain she had caused him. She couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. This was no longer a marriage of love, it was a marriage of vengeance, and she was the target. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd erupted in applause, but for Annabelle, the sound was deafening. The kiss felt like a betrayal, a cold reminder of everything she had lost. She could feel the chill in Caden's touch as he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a gesture that felt mechanical, hollow. There was no passion, no connection, just the formality of a public performance. She pulled away quickly, her heart sinking into her chest. The night that followed was a far cry from what Annabelle had once dreamed of. She had hoped that despite everything, there might be a flicker of the love they once shared. But as they entered their chambers, the reality of their situation hit her harder than ever before. Caden made no attempt to speak to her, to comfort her, to bridge the emotional gap that stretched between them. He was distant, cold, and completely uninterested in her. The bed, once a symbol of intimacy, now felt like a prison. Annabelle lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The silence in the room was deafening. She could feel the emptiness beside her, the absence of the warmth and affection she had once hoped for. Caden lay there, his back turned toward her, as if he were a world away. His body was rigid, unmoving. There was no tenderness in his touch, no whispered words of comfort. The man she had once loved was now a stranger who shared her bed only out of obligation. For Annabelle, the night felt like an eternity. She was torn between the overwhelming guilt of her past actions and the heartache of seeing the man she had once loved become a stranger, someone who no longer cared for her. She lay awake for hours, replaying the memories of their lost love, wondering if there was any chance of reclaiming what they had once shared. But deep down, she knew it was over. The love that had once burned brightly between them had been extinguished by betrayal, and nothing could bring it back. Caden, on the other hand, felt a twisted sense of satisfaction as he lay there, awake but pretending to sleep. He had achieved his goal. He had exacted his revenge. He had won. The woman who had once broken his heart was now bound to him, trapped in a loveless marriage. Every time he turned away from her, every time he refused to speak to her, he felt the satisfaction of her pain. She was now the one who had to endure the consequences of her actions, and for Caden, that was enough. The days that followed the wedding felt like a weight on Annabelle's chest, each one heavier than the last. She had married Caden, the man she had once loved, but now she found herself bound to him in a union that felt like a prison. Guilt consumed her every waking moment. She had betrayed him, and now, as his wife, she was paying the price in ways she had never imagined. The luxurious life she had once dreamed of, one filled with power and prestige, now felt like an empty facade. The riches and status could not erase the growing emptiness inside her, nor the coldness that radiated from Caden whenever she was near him. Annabelle couldn't ignore the aching feeling in her heart whenever she looked at him. He had been her everything once, the one person she had trusted with her love, her heart. But now, he was a stranger to her, someone who kept his distance, who refused to speak to her with anything other than icy formality. She knew she had broken his trust, but it didn't make the isolation any easier to bear. Every attempt she made to reach out to him, to show him a hint of her remorse, was met with indifference. Caden remained distant, his heart seemingly closed off from her forever. She tried small acts of kindness, hoping that maybe, just maybe, one of them would break through the fortress of coldness he had built around himself. She would leave him notes with gentle words of apology, or prepare his favorite meals in the hopes that he would see how deeply she regretted her betrayal. But each effort was met with the same response: silence. Caden never acknowledged her gestures, never seemed to notice them at all. It was as if she had ceased to exist in his eyes, except as a symbol of his pain and anger. The gap between them grew wider with each passing day, and Annabelle's heart began to crack under the weight of her failure. Caden, on the other hand, found himself in a struggle of his own. For all the coldness he had shown, for all the cruelty he had wrought upon Annabelle in the name of revenge, a part of him was beginning to question whether it had been worth it. His anger, which had once burned hot and relentless, began to cool as the days wore on. At first, it was small moments, passing glances, fleeting thoughts, that made him question his decision. He would catch a glimpse of Annabelle, perhaps when she was lost in thought, or when she smiled in a way that reminded him of the woman he had once known, and a pang of regret would stir deep within him. As time passed, the cold mask he had worn began to slip. He noticed things about Annabelle that he had once adored: the way her eyes sparkled when she was passionate about something, the delicate way she carried herself, her kindness toward others. He found himself watching her in silence, his mind at war with itself. She had changed, that much was clear. The woman who had once betrayed him now seemed more vulnerable, more human. And in those moments, Caden found himself questioning whether the hatred he had harbored for her all this time was justified. Could someone who had caused him so much pain truly be deserving of such disdain? Or had he, in his need for revenge, lost sight of who she truly was? His thoughts were never as simple as they once were. Each time he saw Annabelle make a kind gesture, each time he noticed her compassion toward the servants, or the way she tried to bring a bit of warmth into their cold home, something inside him stirred. There was a softness in her that had never been there before. It was almost as if she had been broken by her actions, but in that brokenness, there was a quiet strength that he couldn't help but admire. It was during one of these moments that Caden truly began to notice the change in her. He was passing through the palace gardens when he saw Annabelle kneeling by a small flower bed, her hands gently tending to the plants. A servant had come to her with a complaint about a dish being served to the family, and rather than reacting harshly, as most nobles would, Annabelle had listened, then quietly reassured the servant that it would be handled. There was no arrogance in her voice, no sense of entitlement, just a simple kindness that left Caden momentarily stunned. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something stir within him. It was a strange, unfamiliar sensation, something that resembled tenderness, something that he had thought he had lost forever. His eyes lingered on Annabelle, and for a brief moment, he forgot about the pain, the betrayal, and the anger. In that instant, he saw not the woman who had betrayed him, but the woman who had once been his closest confidant, his love. He realized that she had suffered too, perhaps more than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. It was in this moment that Caden's internal conflict reached its peak. The cold resolve he had clung to for so long began to crack. He had wanted to make her feel the same emptiness that he had felt when he discovered her betrayal. But now, as he watched her from a distance, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong. Was revenge truly the path he wanted to continue down? Or was there a chance for forgiveness, for healing, for something more? Could he ever forgive her? And more importantly, could he ever love her again? Caden didn't have the answers yet. His heart was a battleground, torn between the remnants of the love he had once felt for her and the deep scars left by her betrayal. But in that quiet moment, as he watched her care for the flowers and interact with the world around her with a grace he hadn't seen in years, he began to wonder if there was more to their story than the pain and anger that had defined their past. Could their broken relationship be mended? Could love truly be reborn from the ashes of their ruined trust? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Caden's feelings were changing, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure where those feelings would lead him. As the days passed, the icy walls between Caden and Annabelle slowly began to crumble. For the first time since their marriage, they started to share moments that were more than just the formalities of royal duty. In the quiet corners of their home, away from the watchful eyes of the court, they began to open up to each other. It wasn't easy. The silence between them had stretched for so long that even the simplest conversation felt awkward. But the desire to heal, on both their parts, pushed them forward. One evening, as they sat together in the study, the tension between them finally gave way to words. Caden, his face hard as ever, spoke first. His voice, usually cold and controlled, now trembled slightly with the weight of the years of bitterness he had carried. "Do you even realize the damage you caused, Annabelle?" he asked, his eyes hard as he stared at the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze. Annabelle's heart clenched at the sight of the pain that still lingered in his eyes. She swallowed her own guilt, forcing herself to face him. "I do. I know I hurt you," she said softly. "I never meant to. I thought I was doing what was best for me, for my family. But I was wrong. I was selfish, and I know it now." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of her regret threatening to crush her. Caden didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at her, as if trying to discern whether or not her words were genuine. And in the silence that followed, something changed. The anger, the resentment, began to dissipate, replaced by something that Caden couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But there was a crack in the armor he had worn so tightly for so long. He could see the sorrow in her eyes, and it was enough to remind him of the woman he had once loved. Slowly, he allowed himself to open up, to admit the pain that had been festering inside him for so long. "I hated you for what you did," Caden confessed, his voice low. "I hated the thought of you with him. But what hurt the most was that you didn't even care about me. You tossed aside everything we had like it meant nothing." Annabelle's heart broke as she heard his words. She reached out to him, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on his. "I never stopped caring about you, Caden," she whispered. "But I didn't know how to fight for us. I was too caught up in what others expected of me. I failed you." The weight of her admission settled between them, and for a brief moment, Caden allowed himself to see the depth of her remorse. It wasn't enough to erase the years of pain, but it was a start. For the first time in so long, he saw her not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as someone who had learned from her mistakes. His anger, though not completely gone, began to melt away, replaced by a spark of something else, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. As the days turned into weeks, Annabelle's actions spoke louder than her words. She didn't just sit idly by, waiting for Caden to forgive her. She worked tirelessly to prove to him that she had changed. She became involved in his royal duties, offering her support at public events, using her position to help those in need. She threw herself into charity work, not for the sake of image, but to show Caden that she was no longer the woman who had been consumed by vanity and ambition. Slowly, Caden began to notice the difference in her. She wasn't the same woman who had once used him for her own gain. She was stronger, more compassionate, and infinitely more self-aware. One evening, as they attended a charity gala together, Caden caught a glimpse of Annabelle as she spoke to a group of servants with genuine kindness, asking about their families and offering words of encouragement. Her natural grace had always been present, but now it was tempered with humility. The sight of her, so dedicated and selfless, stirred something in Caden that he hadn't expected. Admiration, respect, and then, unexpectedly, something more. He had been so focused on his anger for so long that he hadn't allowed himself to see her transformation. But now, as he watched her, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever: affection. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He was beginning to care for her again. Annabelle's changes didn't go unnoticed by Caden. He watched her every move, his heart conflicted as he fought the growing tenderness he felt. Guilt washed over him as he reflected on how harshly he had treated her, how he had turned away from her when she had needed him most. The walls he had built around himself, walls constructed by anger and betrayal, were beginning to crumble, and he didn't know how to stop it. And then it happened. One night, as they sat in their study, Annabelle turned to him with a soft smile, her eyes full of hope. "I know it's not easy, Caden," she said quietly, "but I want to make things right. I don't want to be the person I was before. I want to be someone you can trust again." Caden's chest tightened at her words, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. He realized, as he looked into her eyes, that the anger he had held for so long had started to fade. He had spent so much time punishing her, but now, as he saw the woman she had become, he couldn't help but acknowledge the truth. He still loved her. The realization struck him with such force that it nearly took his breath away. He had fought it for so long, refusing to believe that he could ever forgive her, but now it was undeniable. His heart, despite all his efforts, had begun to soften. Caden knew that forgiveness wouldn't come overnight, and that rebuilding their relationship would take time. But in that moment, he understood something fundamental. Revenge had never been the answer. He had sought vengeance, thinking it would bring him peace, but it only led him further into darkness. What he needed, what they both needed, was healing. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for them to find it together. The war within him was far from over, but the first step had been taken. Caden had fallen in love with Annabelle again, and for the first time in a long time, he was willing to let go of the past, to forgive, and to embrace the possibility of a future together. As the days passed, the fragile peace between Caden and Annabelle began to settle, their growing connection offering a glimmer of hope for the future. But just as they started to rebuild what had been broken, the past came crashing back with the unexpected return of Lord Adrian. His arrival was a shock to both Caden and Annabelle. The once arrogant and self-assured lord had returned from his travels, but this time, there was something different about him. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now held an air of regret. He approached Caden first, humbling himself before the prince in a way that left even Caden uncertain of his motives. "I regret the pain I caused, Caden," Lord Adrian confessed, his voice laden with remorse. "I acted out of pride and selfishness, and I see now the damage I've done, not just to you, but to Annabelle. I ask for your forgiveness, and for her sake, I want to make things right." Caden stood frozen, the words hanging heavy in the air. He had never expected to hear such a plea from the man who had once been his closest friend, nor did he anticipate the guilt that would stir inside him. Adrian's presence, however, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The room grew tense as Caden weighed the sincerity of Adrian's apology against the history that bound them. For Annabelle, the return of Adrian stirred up old emotions. It had been Adrian's love that had once pulled her away from Caden, and now, standing before her, was the man who had played such a pivotal role in the wreckage of her life. He had apologized, but the question lingered in her heart. Was her past love for Adrian still alive? Or had she truly moved on as she hoped? Annabelle couldn't avoid it any longer. Adrian had come back seeking forgiveness, and she needed to confront the feelings she had buried deep within her. But her heart, still tender from her betrayal of Caden, refused to give in to the allure of the past. She had made a choice, a difficult one, but it had been a choice she believed was right. And yet, standing before Adrian, she was forced to examine whether the love she once shared with him could ever compete with what she was building with Caden. The tension grew between them, but it wasn't just between Annabelle and Adrian. Caden felt a burning jealousy rise inside him, a fire he thought had long been extinguished. The mere thought of Adrian being near Annabelle again stirred old wounds, and he found himself struggling to maintain his composure. The confrontation between the three of them was inevitable. One evening, as Caden found Annabelle and Adrian talking in the garden, his rage surged, an uncontrollable storm rising within him. His voice was cold and sharp as he stepped into the space between them. "Annabelle," he said, his tone biting, "tell me, are you still in love with him? After everything, after all we've been through, you would let him back into your life so easily?" Annabelle's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly recovered. She turned to Caden, her gaze steady. "Caden, listen to me. You have to understand. Adrian has apologized, but my heart is with you now. What we've built together, what we've worked through, it means more than anything Adrian can offer. I'm not going back to him." But Caden's anger wasn't easily quelled. His eyes narrowed, his fists clenched at his sides. "How can I be sure of that?" he demanded. "How can I trust that you won't run back to him the moment things get hard? You hurt me once, Annabelle. I can't let that happen again." The intensity of Caden's emotions rattled Annabelle, but she held her ground, her voice firm. "You've made me who I am today, Caden, and I won't lose you, not for him, not for anyone. I love you, and that's where my heart is. You have to believe me." There was a pause, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Caden's breath came in shallow gasps as he wrestled with his emotions. His heart ached with jealousy, with fear, but deep down he knew Annabelle was speaking the truth. The forgiveness he had so desperately sought to give her was now put to the ultimate test. His rage slowly began to fade, but the hurt remained. "I want to believe you," he said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. "But I need you to prove it. I need to know that I'm not just another man in your life that you'll abandon when the next temptation comes." Annabelle reached out to him, her hand gentle as it rested on his arm. "I will prove it, Caden. Every day, I will prove it. I want to build a life with you, not with the man I was before, or the man I left behind, but with you, only you." Caden took a deep breath, the last vestiges of his anger dissipating as he looked into her eyes. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust her. But the battle within him was far from over. The path to healing would be long, and Adrian's return had reopened the wounds of the past. Still, for the first time in a long while, Caden allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in months: hope. As Adrian stood in the background watching them, he understood that his role in their lives was no longer to be that of a rival. He had come to apologize, to make amends, but the decision was ultimately Annabelle's to make. And in that moment, he knew there was little he could do to change the course of what had already been set into motion. For Caden and Annabelle, the road ahead was uncertain, but their journey together had only just begun. The air in the grand hall was thick with anticipation as the court watched in silence. The recent tension between Caden, Annabelle, and Adrian had not gone unnoticed, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. It was here, in the presence of nobles and dignitaries, that Caden would make a choice that would alter the course of his future, and the future of his kingdom. Caden stood tall at the front of the hall, his gaze locked on Annabelle. His heart raced, not out of anger or fear, but with the weight of the decision that he knew he had to make. His voice echoed across the room as he began to speak, each word carrying a heavy truth. "Annabelle," Caden began, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "The past between us has been a storm, a tumultuous, unforgiving storm that left us both broken. I spent so long holding on to my anger, consumed by revenge and bitterness. But I realize now that I cannot live in the past any longer." A hushed silence fell over the court as Caden stepped closer to Annabelle, his eyes softening with vulnerability. "I see now that what we've been through is part of our story, but it does not define us. I have hurt you, and I have let my pride blind me to what truly matters." He paused, searching for the right words before continuing. "I have loved you, Annabelle, and despite everything, I still do." Annabelle's breath caught in her throat, her eyes filling with unshed tears. The weight of Caden's words washed over her, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the hope she had held onto so desperately bloomed within her chest. This was the moment she had prayed for, the moment when Caden would look past the pain and see the love that still existed between them. "I forgive you," Caden said, his voice unwavering. "And I promise to move forward with you, not as the man I was, but as the man I wish to become, with you by my side." He turned to face the court, his declaration loud and clear. "I choose Annabelle. I choose love over revenge. I choose healing over resentment. Together, we will rebuild what was broken." Annabelle's heart soared as the realization hit her. The walls between them had finally crumbled, and the love they had once shared was being rekindled. She stepped forward, her voice trembling, but full of conviction. "Caden," she said softly, her eyes locked onto his. "I've always loved you. Even when I made the biggest mistake of my life, I never stopped loving you, and I will never stop. I am yours, body and soul. I pledge to stand by you, to support you, to love you for the rest of our days." A tear slipped down Annabelle's cheek as she spoke, but it wasn't from sorrow. It was from the overwhelming sense of relief and joy that flooded her heart. This was the moment of redemption. This was the moment she had longed for. Caden reached out, gently wiping the tear from her cheek, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. The warmth in his eyes spoke volumes, and in that smile, Annabelle knew they had found their way back to each other. The room erupted in applause, but to Caden and Annabelle, nothing else mattered in that moment except the truth they had just spoken. They had chosen each other, choosing love, forgiveness, and the promise of a future together. The past was behind them, and they were ready to walk forward hand in hand, facing whatever challenges came their way, with love as their guide. The days following Caden and Annabelle's declaration of love were filled with a sense of renewal. The walls of the grand castle, once a symbol of coldness and tension, now echoed with laughter and warmth. Caden and Annabelle, no longer bound by the ghosts of their past, began to rebuild not only their marriage but their kingdom as well. Their union, forged in the fires of betrayal and healed through forgiveness, became a beacon of hope for their people. Caden, once driven by anger and revenge, now stood as a wise and compassionate ruler. His decisions were guided by the love he had rediscovered for Annabelle and the strength he found in forgiveness. Annabelle, ever the queen, supported him with grace and intelligence, working side by side to guide their kingdom to prosperity. The nobles, once skeptical of their reconciliation, soon saw the depth of their bond and the positive changes that followed. Under their leadership, the kingdom flourished. The people felt the shift from the darkness of the past to the light of a brighter future. Caden and Annabelle made a commitment to not only restore their relationship, but to work towards healing the wounds their kingdom had suffered. They invested in education, infrastructure, and the well-being of their citizens. Slowly, but surely, the scars of the past began to fade, and hope blossomed throughout the land. As for Caden and Annabelle, they found peace in each other's arms. The passion that had once been overshadowed by pain was now rekindled, stronger than ever. Their love, though tested by betrayal and sorrow, had grown into something deeper, a love rooted in understanding, patience, and mutual respect. They had learned to forgive, to trust again, and most importantly, to embrace the second chance they had been given. And so, the story of Caden and Annabelle came to a close, not with an end, but with a new beginning. A beginning where love was the foundation, forgiveness was the bridge, and the future was filled with infinite possibilities. Together, they proved that even the most broken hearts could be mended, and that true love could conquer even the greatest of trials.